The wind came crawling over the plains before dawn, cold enough to sting the lungs, mean enough to strip the world of sound. By the time light broke over Ash Hollow, the sky was the color of an old bruise, violet fading to gray, and the town slept beneath a white shroud. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys, thin and uncertain, like prayers afraid to rise too high. In a cottage at the edge of the settlement, where the prairie leaned against the foothills, Evelyn Harrow was already awake. She worked by lamplight, her needle flashing in and out of a torn wool coat, the rhythm slow but steady, as though she were mending her own life stitch by stitch. The room was small, its corners breathing shadows. A kettle hissed softly on the stove, and frost webbed the inside of the window pane. The silence felt deep enough to drown in. She tried not to think about the letter tucked inside the Bible on her table, the one that said her husband's debts would come due come spring, and the land she lived on might no longer be hers. The words in that letter burned worse than any coal she could afford. She stopped sewing and let her gaze drift to the photograph above the mantel. A man in a miner's coat, smiling with the quiet pride of someone who thought the earth would always be kind. He had been gone 2 winters now, buried under stone and darkness when the mine collapsed. Evelyn had wept herself dry that night, and by morning the tears had turned to ice. Since then, she had learned how to be alone without complaint. Loneliness had a way of teaching dignity. When she ventured into town once a week, whispers followed like footsteps. Widow Harrow, poor thing, the one who talks to ghosts. She felt their eyes more than she heard their voices. Sometimes Clara Finch, who ran the general store, would greet her with a smile that cut like glass. "Still stitching for the Lord, Miss Harrow?" she'd ask, pretending kindness. Evelyn would nod, pay for her thread, and leave before the laughter began. Today the air outside felt strange. Too still, too heavy. She had grown up beneath wide skies and knew the moods of the wind, the scent before snow, the silence before a storm. But this was different. She stepped outside, shawl pulled tight, and looked toward the west where the clouds were gathering in coils, black and restless. The horses in the nearby field tossed their heads. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled like a wagon over hollow ground. By noon the horizon was a bruise of moving gray. She went about her chores with the stiff patience of habit, stacking wood, drawing water, covering the small window with oilcloth. The air thickened, and a low hum rose through the ground, the kind of sound that made bones ache. Then came the wind, fierce and spiraling, dragging dust and snow into a wild dance. Evelyn barely had time to secure the door before it hit full force. The cottage shook. The sky roared. Through the window, she saw the world unraveling, a funnel of ice and debris twisting across the plain, devouring fences, barns, and whatever stood proud enough to defy it. She dropped to her knees and prayed aloud, words tumbling faster than breath. Then, over the howling, she heard something that was not wind. The panicked cry of a horse. She ran to the door and pushed against it until it gave way. The wind slammed into her like a living thing. Snow and grit stung her skin. Her hair whipped loose, but she saw him. A man thrown from his horse, crawling, half buried in the storm's breath. Without thinking, she waded into it, leaning forward with each step as if walking through a river of air. She reached him just as he fell still, his coat torn, face ghostly beneath blood and dirt. She gripped his arm, shouted words the storm swallowed, and dragged him toward her door, inch by inch, until they collapsed together across the threshold. Inside, she barred the door and dropped beside him. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. He murmured a single word, Northfield, then went limp. Evelyn pressed her fingers to his throat. His pulse beat faintly, stubborn. She stripped away his wet coat, rolled him near the fire, and covered him with blankets. He was heavy with exhaustion and cold, yet his breathing steadied as warmth crept back into his skin. She cleaned the cut on his temple with trembling hands. The storm screamed outside, but inside her home, a different kind of silence settled. A waiting silence, like a held breath. Hours passed. The wind eased by degrees until only the snow remained, falling soft and secret. Evelyn sat beside the stranger, head nodding from weariness. When she woke, the lamplight had gone out, and gray dawn pressed against the windows. He was awake, watching her. His eyes were the color of the sky after a storm, uncertain, shifting. "Where am I?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Ash Hollow," she said quietly. "You fell in the wind. I brought you in." He tried to sit up, wincing. "You shouldn't have risked yourself." Evelyn's mouth curved in a faint smile. "Would have been cruel to leave you for the crows." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Name's Silas," he said, offering no more. She didn't ask. Names were enough for now. She brought him broth from the kettle, watched him eat slowly, hands shaking slightly. When he finished, he thanked her in a tone that carried weight, as if gratitude were something rare and costly. Outside, the world lay broken. Half the fence was gone, trees uprooted, and her small shed had vanished altogether. The sight should have hollowed her out, but instead she felt a strange calm. They were both alive. That was reason enough. Silas insisted on mending what he could. Though his arm was injured, he worked through the pain, hammering the fence back into place, clearing fallen branches. Evelyn joined him, her skirts dragging through the snow, the two of them moving in quiet rhythm. She noticed the steadiness of his hands, the deliberate care he took even in small tasks. When their eyes met, neither looked away quickly enough. By evening, the cottage smelled of stew and cedar smoke. They ate in near silence. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock and the soft sigh of the wind returning to gentleness. At one point, Silas reached for his cup and brushed her hand. Both froze. Neither spoke. It was not romance, not yet. Just the startled awareness of another living soul after too much solitude. Later, while he slept, she studied his face in the firelight. He bore the look of a man accustomed to hiding, jaw clenched even in rest, a scar tracing his cheek like a faded memory. She wondered what road had brought him here, what kind of life left a man to ride straight into a storm. But she did not touch the questions. Some things, she'd learned, reveal themselves only when they're ready. The next day, townsfolk rode out to inspect the damage. From behind her window, Evelyn saw Clara Finch among them, bundled in her fur-trimmed coat, pointing toward the cottage with a knowing smirk. She heard snippets of conversation carried on the cold air. "That widow's taken in a drifter. Ain't proper. She'll regret it." Evelyn's cheeks burned, but she didn't move. Silas, standing by the hearth, caught her expression. He said nothing, just began fixing the door hinge that had come loose during the storm. The sound of his work filled the space between them. Metal against wood, steady, sure. Shame ebbed from her slowly, replaced by a quiet resolve. Let them talk. They always had. When the visitors left, she opened the door, letting the crisp air wash through the room. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, and sunlight glittered over the snow. Silas stepped outside beside her, rolling his shoulders as though testing the strength in them. He looked toward the horizon, where miles of white stretched unbroken. "Storm's done its part," he said softly. Evelyn nodded. "So it seems." But in her chest, something unfamiliar stirred. A faint, unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She didn't name it. She only felt it bloom and fade like the breath of a ghost. That night, as they sat by the fire, Silas spoke of leaving once the roads cleared. She said she understood. Yet when he turned his gaze to her, she caught a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a shadow of the same thought she was trying to bury. How strange it was that two strangers could find peace, even for a few days, when the rest of the world seemed made of loss. Outside, the snow began again, softer this time, falling in slow spirals that shimmered in the lamplight. Evelyn watched it through the window, the corners of her mouth lifting in something close to a smile. Behind her, Silas was mending the strap of his saddle, humming a low tune she didn't recognize. She thought, for the first time in years, that maybe winter wasn't the enemy she'd made it out to be. Maybe it was simply a season that stripped away everything false, leaving only what could endure. By the time she rose to bank the fire, Silas had fallen asleep in the chair, hat tilted low over his brow, the tune still faint on his lips. Evelyn paused, studying him. This stranger who had fallen from the sky and landed in her solitude. She drew the blanket from the bed and placed it over his shoulders. For a long moment, she stood watching the fire's light move across his face, the warmth chasing away the chill. Outside, the wind whispered along the eaves like a voice remembering its own story. And though she didn't know it yet, the storm had carried more than ruin to her door. It had brought the beginning of something that would change her life in quiet, unspoken ways. When she finally blew out the lamp, the darkness that followed felt softer than it ever had before. The days that followed folded into one another like pages of a quiet hymn. The storm had left the land scarred and silvered, but beneath its ruin, a strange peace settled over Ash Hollow. Evelyn and Silas fell into a rhythm without ever naming it. He repaired what the wind had broken, she cooked, sewed, and tried not to imagine how empty the house might feel once he left. Their conversations came in fragments, small as snowflakes, and each seemed to melt before it fully formed. Yet there was comfort in those silences. It was the kind that asked for nothing but company. Every morning, Silas stepped outside before sunrise. his boots sinking into the frost. Evelyn watched from the window as he gathered fallen branches or traced the fence line, his breath rising in pale clouds. Sometimes he'd catch her watching and raise a hand in wordless greeting. She'd turn away too quickly, heart unsteady, needle slipping from her fingers. There was no sense wanting something so uncertain, and yet the wanting came all the same, uninvited as the winter wind. One evening he sat sharpening his knife by the hearth. The sound a soft scrape against the quiet. She was patching the sleeve of his coat and caught him studying her. His voice came low. "You've got hands that don't give up." She didn't look up. "They've had to learn not to." He smiled faintly, eyes shadowed by the firelight. "Ain't many like that left." Outside, the snow began again, gentle, almost apologetic. Evelyn wondered what road he'd taken before this one. What kind of man wandered into a storm alone? But she kept her questions folded tight, afraid that knowing too much might end whatever fragile peace had taken root between them. By the 7th morning, the sky cleared to a pale winter blue. The air carried a brittle stillness that only comes after days of unrest. Silas stood at the window, coat buttoned, gloves in hand. "The roads'll be passable now," he said. "Time I moved on." Evelyn paused mid-stitch. The words fell like a sudden draft across the room. She nodded, her voice steady though her pulse betrayed her. "You've got places to be, I expect." He looked toward the door, then back at her. "You've done more than most would. I won't forget it." She tried to smile, but it trembled. "Don't worry. The town will remind me plenty." He hesitated, as if wanting to say something more, but instead he only tipped his hat and stepped out into the pale morning. The sound of his horse fading down the trail left the room unbearably still. Evelyn stood by the window long after he disappeared, her fingers pressed against the cold glass, as though she could touch the space he'd left behind. By noon, Sheriff Amos Greeley arrived on horseback, face creased with concern. Behind him rode Clara Finch, her coat furred and her eyes alight with curiosity. The sheriff dismounted, snow crunching under his boots. "Evelyn," he called, "need a word." She opened the door, wary. "What's this about?" "About that man been stayin' here. Some talk going round." Clara's voice slipped in before he could continue. "They say he's no drifter at all. Some claim he's buying up half the county. Others say he's wanted in Northfield." Her smile was all sugar and venom. "You always did have a way of finding trouble, dear." Evelyn's heart stumbled. "You're mistaken," she said, though the words felt weak even to her. The sheriff rubbed his chin. "A rancher rode through town this morning," said his boss, Silas Wren, "went missing during the storm. Wren's the one been buying all that land. Half the valley belongs to him now." Evelyn blinked, stunned. "Wren?" The name tasted foreign. She stepped back, the world tilting. If what the sheriff said was true, the quiet man by her fire had been one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Clara gave a soft, mocking laugh. "Seems you took in a stranger worth keeping after all." Evelyn's cheeks flamed. "He didn't tell me who he was." "Course he didn't," Clara said. "Men like that don't mix with our kind unless they've got a reason." The sheriff shot Clara a look to hush her, then turned back to Evelyn. "If he left anything behind, best hand it over. Might clear the air." After they left, she searched the cabin, her hands trembling. Beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a sealed envelope. Her name was written on it in a strong, unhurried hand. Inside lay a deed, crisp and official, transferring ownership of her land and acres beyond to Evelyn Harrow. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor. The paper shook in her hands. She didn't know whether to weep or curse. Was it charity, pity, or something else entirely? Every whisper she'd endured, every sideways glance, now burned hotter in her chest. She thought of Clara's smirk, of the sheriff's pity, and wanted to tear the deed in two. But when she looked closer, she saw the inked signature at the bottom. Silas Wren. That night, the wind rose again, restless and cold. She couldn't sleep. She kept hearing his voice. The way he'd said, "You've got hands that don't give up." Perhaps he'd meant the land as thanks, or perhaps it was an apology for something she didn't yet understand. Either way, she felt as though the world had tilted under her feet once more. At dawn, she dressed and walked into town, clutching the envelope. The streets were hushed under new snow. She entered the small wooden church and placed the deed upon the altar. The preacher looked up startled. "I don't want what isn't mine," she said quietly. "If he meant to help, he should have asked if I needed it." The preacher frowned. "Child, it's a blessing." She shook her head. "Blessings shouldn't come with whispers." She turned and walked out before he could reply. Outside, Sheriff Amos waited by his horse. His expression had softened. "Evelyn," he said gently, "I looked into it. Wren ain't the man they said. He's no thief. He's been buying land to rebuild what the storms ruined. Guess he wanted to do some good without his name getting in the way." Evelyn's breath caught. Then why hide? The sheriff shrugged. Maybe he wanted to see who'd help him when he had nothing to his name. She stood there in the cold long after he rode off, the snow falling lightly over her hair. She thought of Silas kneeling by the hearth, mending her broken door without being asked. Maybe he had been testing the world the way she once tested herself. Quietly, painfully, hoping to find something honest left in it. By the second evening, the wind changed again, carrying with it the distant promise of another storm. Evelyn went out to secure the stable, the snow swirling around her like ghosts. When she turned back toward the house, she saw movement on the ridge. A lone rider against the pale sky, moving with urgency. Her heart stilled. The horse crested the hill, hooves flinging snow. Silas rode straight for her, face raw with windburn, coat torn from travel. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. "I thought you were gone," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "I was," he answered, eyes dark with something unspoken. "But some things won't stay gone." She stared at him, anger and relief tangling inside her. "You lied to me." He nodded, guilt in the slope of his shoulders. "I did. I didn't mean harm, Evelyn. I wanted to know what kind of person you were before the name meant anything." "You didn't have to test me. I had to test myself," he said quietly. "I've spent years buying land, fixing things money broke, but it never fixed me. Then you dragged me out of that storm without asking who I was. You gave me more mercy than I ever deserved." The wind whipped between them, scattering snow like ash. She looked at him long and hard, seeing the truth in the exhaustion of his face. "You think you can make it right with a piece of paper?" she asked. He reached into his coat and drew out the same envelope, edges damp from his journey. "Not charity," he said, voice steady. "A promise. You keep your land because it's yours, and I'll keep my word to stand by it. If you'll let me." She hesitated. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fine frost in his hair, the scar that caught the firelight when he smiled faintly. "I didn't come back for forgiveness," he said. "I came back because the quiet after you left was worse than any storm I've ever ridden through." The words struck something deep and aching within her. She turned away, afraid of what might show on her face. "You don't know what you're asking," she murmured. "Maybe not," he said, voice low. "But I know what I'm offering. A chance to start again. You and me, side by side. Doesn't have to be love yet. Just two folks learning how to live without fear." Snow drifted between them, glittering under the lantern light spilling from her doorway. She looked into his eyes and saw no pity, no claim, only quiet respect, the kind she hadn't known in years. Slowly, she reached out, took the envelope from his hand, and held it between them. "You can stay till spring," she said softly. "The land will need tending." His smile was small but real. "Then I reckon I've got work to do." He turned to unsaddle his horse, and she followed him inside, the warmth of the fire curling through the cold air. Neither spoke again that night, but the silence that filled the cabin was no longer empty. It hummed with the fragile rhythm of trust beginning to take shape. By morning, the storm had passed, and the world outside gleamed beneath a sky of pale gold. Evelyn stood at the window, watching the snow melt into silver streams that ran toward the valley. Silas was already outside, shoulders bent to his work, smoke rising behind him from the mended chimney. She thought of how the world had tried to break her, and how somehow it had failed. Perhaps storms were not punishments at all, but invitations. To rebuild, to forgive, to believe that not all endings were meant to close. When Silas looked up and caught her gaze, she smiled, a small, true smile that reached the corners of her eyes. Old Benji's voice would later tell the story across campfires, claiming he'd seen that morning himself, the widow and the cowboy standing in the melt of a winter that had nearly undone them. He'd say storms don't just tear down, they make space for grace to enter. And if Evelyn ever heard those tales, she never corrected them. She only kept watching the horizon, the world wide open once more, her heart quiet and sure in its thaw. So if you ever find yourself lost in a storm, remember her, the widow who offered shelter to a stranger, and in doing so, found the strength to shelter herself. If this story touched your heart, stay a while, and subscribe for more Wild West tales, where every storm hides a miracle waiting to be found.